going to be here a while because I have a lot of text to get through. Yeah. No, as Jim says, with the NIH, National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, I worked on the survey for Galway and various other parts of the country. It was always a great pleasure doing field work. My principal job for the last couple of years has been, number one, I was asked to draw up a national strategy for vernacular heritage. I call it Built Vernacular Heritage because I want to try and get away from the word architecture in some ways, because architecture is very confining. Architecture tends to be about buildings, whereas the vernacular is about the landscape. And I'm actually more interested in the glue between the buildings than the buildings themselves. I've sort of gone off buildings per se. I'm very interested in things like paths and routeways, gates and styles, things like lime kilns, all that sort of thing, field boundaries. That's the stuff which really gets me going these days. If I thought of it, I would have brought booklets here today. I would have been able to bring copies, hard copies of the strategy document, Os Bearla agus Os Gaeilge, and the same for the Caring for Our Vernacular Heritage, but I didn't think of it. Anyway, there you have it. But it is available online as a PDF, but if anybody wants copies of any of that, talk to Jim and I'd be quite happy to post them out to people. Okay? The architectural introduction to the architectural inventory of County Galway is in a cofra in Tullamore at the moment. I happened to be in the Cork office there the other day, and I was able to get just a dozen copies or something that happened to be there. But if anybody would like a copy of either the Introduction to the Architectural Heritage of County Galway, and which is a fine piece of work, I put it together myself, so it's a fine piece of work. That's right. Yeah. So it's nice. I'm happy about it. Or the vernacular publications, just give me a shout. At the moment, significantly, we're working on a handbook for the conservation, repair and maintenance of vernacular buildings. And we have contracted writers from all over the place, including one from Scotland, to write on matters such as mud walling, thatch, the three different methods. There's scalloped, there's roped, and there's truss thatch. So I've gotten a thatcher in each of those methods to write up what they do and how they go about things and the pitfalls and all the rest of it. And also we have people on stone, wicker, straw rope, all that sort of thing. So hoping to cover all the bases for the care of vernacular buildings. So that'll be a first really for the country. We have regular and ongoing discussions with our colleagues in the north. I like to keep an all-island focus. When I was doing my my doctoral dissertation, I deliberately plonked one of my study areas actually on the border at Strabane. So I was picking up West Tyrone and East Donegal, and there was method in that madness. It wasn't a sort of territorial claim or anything like that. But it's you always have to be careful when you're talking about north-south matters. To be, there's language which is delicate and has to be carefully adhered to and that sort of thing. Now, I'm not here to represent the department today, so I'm sure you can say what I like, but I'm mindful that you just don't. But we've got a really, really good relationship with our colleagues in Belfast. They've been fantastic. We piggyback on what they do, and they piggyback on what we do. And there is no point in reinventing the wheel. It is just a waste of time. So that's one of our tenets, if you like, for dealing with these matters. We are trying to really pull together all the different strands that interconnect with vernacular, and it's very diffuse. It's not like, say, the auctioneers and valuers, they have their association, or even, say, early historians, they tend to hang out together and have their association. But what do you call people who deal with vernacular buildings, vernacular heritage? Vernacularists, vernacular students. There's no decent, nice, neat little term. They tend to be people, say, from S.N. Evans in the 1930s, who was a geographer, to some people who have come in from, say, architectural studies, but others, like myself, from folklore studies. And to me, it's actually hardcore tradition is the key. I notice in a lot of definitions of vernacular, say, well, it's buildings that are of local style, made with local materials and that sort of thing. But that's only half the story, and it's not even the most interesting half, or the more interesting half. The more interesting half is the tradition that underpins the whole thing, and that tradition is global. Exactly the same sort of mentality was used in the composition of vernacular things, whether it's a child's cradle, to the interior of a house, to a farmyard, to a settlement, and in fact, the farming landscape. All those different scales of the vernacular are to be found throughout the planet. And it's something that I think is something we should keep in mind. We're not some isolated aberration off the west edge of the European continent. We're part of an ancient global setup, which is the vernacular. And the vernacular differs from the formal. If you think of, say, Houseman's Paris, with all these, circuses or circles, like it's parts of London as well, and you have these boulevards all radiating in straight lines. That is the antithesis of the vernacular. The vernacular is higgledy-piggledy, not because people designed it to be higgledy-piggledy, but because people designed it in a more organic way, a more relaxed, a more informal way. So Menlo, the settlement of Menlo, is quite different to the sense of the centre of Galway city, for example. His nibs will be all right, he's just, he coughs a bit. So he's not dying or anything, so you're not fionn. So anyway, I get cracking. My studies I carried out in the noughties and into the teenies, or whatever language you use these days to describe those years. Anyway, I chose Menlo, which is one of the most interesting settlements of any sort on the island of Ireland. But before we get into that, I'm going to talk about... Jim gave me the title of the Vernacular Heritage, I think, of the Lough Corrib region, which I'm certainly not going to talk about because that's much too big. And anyway, I have very limited knowledge. I don't know every single building in the Lough Corrib area, so I'm going to tackle it from other points of view. So this is the National Inventory of Architectural Heritage, relevant bit of the map for the Lough Corrib area. The blue dots are architectural sites, if you like, recommended by the Minister for Protection. Not all are protected structures. And most of the blue dots, most of them that are vernacular buildings, are thatch. Thatch is the thing that attracts more attention than anything else. It is the most vulnerable of the vernacular buildings. And this is just a little smattering of a few around the lake. So this is just a little random sample of them. There's a pattern you can see. 4 bays. So in other words, three windows and a doorway in the front elevation is very typical. Some are smaller. There's a 3-bay one in Menlo, for example, and others are bigger. But, this is sort of very much a national pattern of 4-bay buildings. Pitched roofs in Galway rather than hipped roofs. And then they tend to have, the fireplace tends to be, at that sort of location, away from the doorway. In Kilkenny, Tipperary, a place like that, the chimney will be almost directly over the doorway, because when you go in through that doorway, you're met by a little baffle wall, often with a window in it, and the fireplace is behind that. So it's a fundamentally different house form to what you get in this region. So this is the western half of Ireland has this type of house in slightly varying forms. Now, I use the word hamlet unashamedly, and the term clachan has been used many times to describe what I'm talking about, but it's not a good word, not a good term really. It's based on a Scottish term which always has, for a settlement, which always is a church. So it's confusing and not madly helpful. Clachan is also more associated with a particular type of farming system, Rundale, but not all clachans, if you like to put it in inverted commas, would be related to that system. So I think it's much better to use a neutral term like Hamlet does what it says in the tin. Hamlet has come to, it's an English term, but it's come from a French term, which originally came from a Germanic term. One of the objections to using the word Hamlet is, oh, isn't it an English word? I don't know where to start with that. I even heard that from geographers. Anyway, I'll go on. So I'm using the term unashamedly. This map is from McCourt, Desmond McCourt, geographer in Queens, who put it together based on the Ordnance Survey maps of 1840. That's his words, not mine. And you can see that there are massive densities in Connacht, in parts of Ulster, and in the southeast. And then apparently emptyish bits in between, which can reflect mountains and bog and so on. So this area is relatively dense in settlements. That's one of its key features. and that's the area. That's the area that I looked at in this particular region. A close up of it, the red markings indicate pretty much the extent of the area of these settlements on the first edition Ordnance Survey map. So you can see there's lots of them. The sort of linear ones are row settlements, and the ones which are more blobby are what we call agglomerations. My way of looking at things was to take McCourt's map, treat it like an archaeological site, and do a few test trenches. And test trenches were the study areas that I took. So I homed in on dense areas, less dense, and then bare areas, just to see what the reality was. And then I looked at a particular district. And at the centre of that district would have been focused on a place in which I was doing a lot of detailed further study, including recorded interviews with inhabitants of the place. So that was really important for me. So on the one hand, I had this cartographically based study, which was very intense, which involved computer mapping and databases and all the rest of it. On the other end, I was talking to real people, talking about their home place. And the two actually do work. You can work them together, you know. So they're quite opposite ways of approaching it. So one is like almost very statistical, and the other is very, I suppose, qualitative. Menlo is at the centre. I think there's a gadget here, a pointer. Not sure which one is the pointer. Is it that? Yeah, that's Menlo. Coola, various other places, Claddagh, and so on. So you can see that there's a lot of fairly biggish settlements in this particular area. 3 of the 4 biggest settlements in the district focused in Galway city. So Galway was always a hub of activity and population that attracted large groupings of housing on the outskirts. You see this also in the likes of Drogheda and pretty much every country town in the first edition era of, say, the 1830s, 1840s. What tended to happen was throughout the 20th century, local authorities basically cleared away a lot of these, what would be called cabin suburbs, and replaced them with more modern housing for people. So that's a process which is logical, really, in many ways, but does remove an interesting layer from our heritage. So the red polygons reflect settlement size, and there's the altitude shadings. You needn't worry too much about that. The hatched areas are domains. So Menlo, Castle, and so on is that block there. But you can see that there's quite a concentration of domains in the district, and much of it focused on the river, but also on the lake. In other words, the nicest bits were often grabbed by the landlords, and I suppose you'd call it part of the dispossession process. And we've sort of been reclaiming it bit by bit since. And in fact, I think the works done in Menlo Castle is sort of part of that process. I mentioned the word colonialism in a series of lectures I was giving at UCD, and a couple of students, really took offence. I said, I'm going to mention the C word. The C word is very important, and we just shy away from it too much and too often. The colonial impact on our vernacular heritage it's pretty plain. If you go to, even next door to Wales, you go to Brittany, you go to the Netherlands, you see a really robust vernacular furniture heritage, for example. What we have is skimpier, it's based on cheaper woods and so on. It's not as decorative, it's not as ancient. So we probably have our vernacular, indeed general culture, the language as well, went on a trajectory which is different to what it would have been on had there not been the colonial impact, shall we say. So it is important. It's also affected sizes of buildings and all sorts of things. Then one of the most interesting things about looking at hamlets is looking at their forms and types. So agglomerations, well, 1/3 of them are agglomerations in this particular district, and about roughly 60% are rows. Now, in some parts of the country, like for example, Dingle Peninsula, it's the other way around. You get far more, if you like, clumps of buildings with, inverted commas, no apparent order, versus rows. So North County Dublin, for example, rows are absolutely dominant, like about 80%. So there are very different patterns in different parts of the country. I picked 5 study areas on the island and I was gobsmacked by the differences between them. I wasn't expecting it. I went in with my eyes open, but being, shall we say, ready to listen to what the material told me. So this pattern of, agglomeration versus row is a very significant feature to be studied, and it varies from region to region. There are subtypes. Parallel, in case of agglomerations, is where you get the buildings of the settlement parallel to each other. Now, it's startlingly obvious on the first edition maps for Kilkenny, for example, or more particularly the likes of the Dingle Peninsula, but also particularly Atlantic areas where you have rigidly arrayed lines of buildings, outbuildings and farmhouses. I should really have said that in the case of, say, Kilkenny, what you get is farmyards laid out like the squares on a chessboard. One farmyard exactly contiguous to the next. Now, you don't get that in this part of the country, or indeed in Dingle Peninsula. So there's quite a difference between hamlets of one part of the country and those of another part. And that is very interesting. I think that's really a very joyful thing to experience. Coola, not too far away, is a definite small agglomeration. And then this, I forget exactly the name of this, and I'm not going to worry too much about it, is more of a peripheral settlement. There is this settlement form which goes around something. It can be an area of unreclaimed land, for example. So there's a bit of that. There's a lot, if you look at the first edition ordnance maps versus the third edition ordnance maps, there is a vast change. And particularly if you look into areas like Connemara, they're almost unrecognisable in terms of the road network, the placement of buildings and so on. And what has come and what has gone is very striking. Then, say the Terryland area, which has been mentioned, this is the first edition, not recognisable like that today, but you can see it's mostly rows, some small little clumps, a little parallel thing going on here and there. But row settlements of various sorts. Almost all extinguished today by new roads, by housing development and so on. Encroachment, particularly by the city, has been quite striking. So the size of settlements in 1838, reds are most common, just under, say, 0 to 20 buildings. Orange, 20 to 50. Purple, more than 50. So Menlo, for example, more than 50. And so there's a couple of buildings, a couple of settlements which had more than 50 buildings. And then when you look at the third edition map, you can see that some settlements are black, which means they're gone. So you get a total erasing of settlements. This is particularly true in parts of, say, Roscommon and parts of Mayo, where the Congested Districts Board or the Land Commission completely eradicated hamlets. They were at this in the 17th and 18th century in Sweden, for example. They were at it from the 16th century in Britain. And this sort of thing has been going on. It's a worldwide phenomenon. It happens in all eras and happens in all places. The idea is to put order on the disordered, to regularise that which is seen to be irregular. Of course, today we love the irregularity. We go to hill towns in Sweden, in Spain, in Italy, in France, and we think they're absolutely gorgeous. We love the human values of them, the small scale of them, the higgledy-piggledyness, the fact that you come along and you have to go up steps and you go down a sort of around a bend and this sort of thing. And that's the antithesis of, what, say, town planners classically or architects classically would be on for. So it's a fundamentally different way of looking at the world, at how people get around, as humans, I suggest, So, and then 5 settlements in the area had all the buildings of their townland in 1838, and that has to be a significant phenomenon. Later on, everything gets dispersed and more houses get built on the edges and so on. But you can see the change through time. So 177 would be people, 34 is houses. at the top line. 100, then it drops to 130, drops to 79, 53, and so on. And the number of buildings drops number of houses drops correspondingly. So you can do this as an exercise for any part of the country, but it just shows essentially decline after the famine in so many of these settlements. Interestingly, the settlement on the Great Blasket actually increased population on the 1851 census, and you don't get more isolated than the Great Blasket. So I thought that was very interesting. Settlements generally on the peninsula actually survived rather well. The famine didn't really seem to hit them as much. What did get clobbered was the roadside settlement of the poorest people. They were wiped out, and their settlements and housing was wiped out. Relative changes of population over time. So you're down to 24% of the population in 1901 that you had in 1841. So we were all familiar with the massive decline. Looking at names, this is from Griffith's valuation around about 1870. You can see in the case of Menlo, 28 houses occupied by people called Francis, 11 by Connells, Fahys, and so on. So you could call the place Francistown or Ballyfrancis or something like that. And there are examples of that sort of thing all over the country. So you get an idea of the diversity of kinship or marrying in these settlements just by looking at the surnames. So I mentioned Cavan suburbs earlier. This is out sort of Rahoon direction, Shantallow, I should say. You can see that you had lines of houses. There on the way in, I passed along here, and there's not a sausage left of any of this. It's all been modernised and so on along by Lough. Old photographs, there are plenty of old photographs showing these places. Now the Claddagh is a sad case. The Claddagh seems to have been built, the Claddagh as we knew it was built post 1764 and pre 1838. That's as far as you could go, because the earlier maps show a completely different arrangement at the Claddagh. So the Claddagh fishing village as we remember it before it was demolished and cleared out by the council in the 30s and 40s, it was a late 18th century, early 19th century settlement. I mean, it's not medieval, it's not later medieval or anything like that, but it is on the site of late medieval settlement in general. You can see that in the maps, it's very, very evident. And so the Padre O'Dowd's book, for example, down by the Claddagh, has lots of maps and so on. You can compare the maps and you can read what is going on. So these are just some pictures of the Claddagh, the famous aerial photograph showing the density of buildings. It's interesting that there's a photograph, in the photograph there is it's like electrical pole or a telegraph pole, whatever. To me, that's suggesting this place is viable. I mean, why else would they be putting in facilities like that? In other parts of the world, they're tending more to, and we would today, if the Claddagh was still there today, we'd be talking about conserving it. It'd be, it would be like the number one tourist attraction in the country, I'd suggest, but anyway, it's gone, and that's that. So this was, again, from Padre O'Dowd's book, putting all the surnames onto the houses to, if you like, humanise the map and the aerial photographs. So this was, an act of iconoclasm, really, on the part of Galway Corporation at the time. Like, they wouldn't hang on to even one building. They were that ashamed of the Claddagh. They wanted rid of it, absolutely. So they were Baron Houseman of the West, of Ireland, you might say. It was a terrible, terrible shame to lose every single building. Then these various photographs show what's happening. The older buildings, some are just about hanging on, and the new buildings going in behind them. So here's Johnny doing his best to demolish the built Vernacular Heritage. But what he's doing is he's clearing away what were seen to be unfit and insanitary housing to prepare the way for better housing for the people that are there. So that's what was happening. So I'm not going to comment any further on that, it would be unfair. So this was the last one, and it was eventually cleared. So you ended up, that was the Claddagh as we knew it, and this is what it has become. Interesting in itself, a little bit like sort of a garden suburb approach. So from an urban design point of view, quite interesting. And so this is from the graveyard looking down, and then some of the buildings. But there's still, I think, probably great character in the modern Claddagh, and probably great neighbours and so on, and probably a lot of the names are still there. But it's just interesting. Coola, through the maps, the aerial photographs today, sometimes the most recent ordnance maps aren't very good, and they're good for comparative purposes, but they're not accurate. I've seen many cases where they've left out buildings or shown a roofed structure as an open area, or an open area as a roof structure. So there's lots of mistakes. So I just urge caution when you're using the modern maps. You nearly have to just see on the ground, are they correct? I would have more faith in the 25-inch maps from the late 19th century, turn of the 20th century, and indeed the first edition Ordnance Survey maps. There was an unbroken tradition of map making, which was lost, I have to say, at the foundation of the state. They kept it in the north, they kept it in Britain. Quality of modern cartography is poor, and in fact I wouldn't call it. I find it difficult to dignify it with the term cartography at all. It's not great. So these are the last few buildings there at Coola that survive today, vernacular buildings, and then this is what we have. We have one thatched house, the back wall, a door, which is very typical, balancing the front door, sort of a true passage sort of idea, front and back door, very typical of the West. No windows, and that's not untypical. There's a house near me and it has no windows in the back wall. The back wall faces north. Good sense in that. An outbuilding, corrugated, and then another house which was on the market. I hope they've been nice to it and kind to it and used gentle rehabilitation rather than a bulldozer. But it's in the lap of the gods. So then just Menlo then, through the ages, through the maps. Menlo still has quite an interesting feel to it. If you sort of get past the very long lines of ribbon housing on the approach roads, it still has great character, and that character is given to it by the variety of roads, lanes and paths, and also the reasonable survival of vernacular buildings. So this is the Lough. I'm never quite sure why Menlo Oscalia is Mionloch with an A rather than an O. So I mean, I would always thought I was Mionloch, L-O-C-H, but Mionloch is definitely the standard spelling for it. But I'm always sort of thrown by that, I have to say. And sometimes the Mionloch is quite dry, and other times it's quite healthy in terms of water. The bottom picture there is at the back of late Paddy Lawless's house, and it's Crishawarriga, or on Crish, so it's a stone with a cross on it. And it had been given a scalp by a digger or something at some stage and was repaired. But it's pretty much the centre of Menlo. It's like the equivalent of the Spire in Dublin, albeit on a very small scale. But that little bit of Menlo is particularly evocative. Paddy's house, the stone walls around it, the Crish, and then various field paths that are across the road and go into land on that side. The far end of it then, you have a couple of houses. The one on the right is probably, to me, the most unchanged building in the place, and really, quite important to hang on to. So there's, we really do, in the case of Menlo, we really do need to hang on to anything that's vernacular in the place, because let's face it, the entire district is full of new housing, new buildings, huge industrial-sized sheds of various sorts. So we really do need to hang on to the vernacular if we want to retain local distinctiveness. It's really critical. So this is Tupper Biddy's well. It seems to be one of the main wells in the place. Otherwise, people use the water from the river or the lake. So it's not exactly coming down with wells, funny enough, in Menlo. Menlo Castle, a nice ivy-clad image of it before all the work that's been done recently to unveil all the different features. That's one of the little paths. And I think this is the stuff of the vernacular landscape, these little paths, pedestrian paths connecting one place to another in a very informal and sort of almost quirky sort of way, I suppose. But you will get these if anybody is familiar with our neighbours across the water, footpaths. They have an astonishing system of footpaths across in Blighty, and they're just, we've nothing like it here, absolutely nothing. But you have them within villages, you have them connecting villages to other villages, and that's something that we did have. I'm sure of it. We had it on the first edition map, so you can see where various hamlets connected to other ones, and to villages, and to churches, and all the rest of it. This is another field path. Also at Menlo, there's a series of boulders which have an important folkloric and place-making or place-locating emphasis for people. Leabhar Hamáis Leilis is very interesting, or Seanachas Hamáis Leilis? Seanachas, yeah. It's a very interesting book if you really sift through it. And I was giving a talk in Kuwait City, of all places. I was talking about Menlo and various parts of Ireland, particularly Menlo, actually. And what they did, interestingly, in Kuwait City was they cleared away old Kuwait, the old Arab city, to make way for modernity. And they did it in a very calculated and focused way. So they got all the leading architects of the world at the time in to design contemporary buildings in the 1950s, and particularly 1950s. These buildings themselves are now under pressure from corporate headquarters and skyscrapers and all the rest of it. So it's very interesting. But I could see a parallel with the Claddagh, Kuwait City and the Claddagh. Yeah. So this is an analysis of dates of buildings. So the reds are pre-1830, pre the first edition map. So you can see the odd one here, for example, one there, one there. Not many that predate the first edition map. So if you think back to that huge splurge and agglomeration of buildings, there are a handful left of those. And then the green ones are 1839 to 1900, browns 1900, 1970, and then the light green, and then a vibrant green and purples are more recent buildings. Now, if you were to include the roads coming in, it would just be purple, 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 just purple everywhere because of the way development has gone in the district. So this is certainly one of the oldest houses in the place, and you can see the size of the windows brings you back to an era where home of the year people wouldn't be happy with this. Where's the wall of glazing? Where's the double height spaces? Where's the connection with the garden, etc.? This wouldn't compute at all. So this is from an era when the door was constantly left open, and there are plenty of people around the country with vernacular houses or labourers' cottages, and keep the front door open. During the day, they're out and about all the time. It's only at night time they would close the door. They're getting ventilation, so no airtightness now. The SEAI would not approve. They're not into that sort of thing. They're hardier people. They don't need as much light as us moderns need, internet access and all the rest of it. So it does represent the most unchanged buildings do represent a way of life which has gone. A lot of people would say it's gone for the better, and that good riddance to it. And others would say that maybe we've lost something. I wouldn't advocate that people live in anything less than comfortable conditions. And that's what the handbook is about, and that's what our work on the vernacular is about. It's trying to make buildings comfortable without wrecking them. So you don't get Johnny the average builder in. You have to get somebody who knows what they're about and isn't going to compromise the future of the building. So, adding external cladding to that and getting in there with heat pumps and all the rest of it would just be all a bit silly, to be quite honest. So one of the earliest houses in the top there that Jim was talking about, a slightly later one, and then much more common ones that we're all very familiar with. So I've never had a problem with bungalows. I remember recently hearing, I was at a talk in Armagh, I think it was, and there was all I can say is a rant by a certain individual who has made great play with bungalow bashing over the decades, and it was unreconstructed and really unhealthy, I thought. You know, people build bungalows because they are the modern rural house. End of story. I've never had it in for bungalows, despite being interested in vernacular. I don't see it's not a battle to fight. It's sterile and it goes nowhere. Outbuildings of various sorts. And then there's Paddy Lawless's house. There's Paddy at his kitchen hearth. Always a glass of whiskey. And he had I think it was mayor of some Japanese city pictured in the recent publication on... Is it? Yeah. That's it, yeah. And I think he had a Glen of Frischke in his loft, yeah. This is Paddy's dresser. Dresser is always the most elaborate piece of furniture in a vernacular house. Sacred Heart with the little holy shelf below it. I have a book at home called Home Altars of Mexico, and that phenomenon of the home altar with the different statues of the Sacred Heart lamp is something that's found, I suppose, throughout the Catholic world. But I was quite stunned by the photographs in that book on Mexico, because I thought, this is Ireland. They even have a version of the Bridget's Cross, one of the more elaborate ones with multiple lozenges in Mexico. And now, I'm not going to go all Bob Quinn or anything like that, but it's just interesting that you have similar, that you can have similar phenomena in different parts of the world. Now, this is a photograph of the father, who was a champion rower, and this is well set out in William Henry's book, a nice book. So there was a lot of living in these houses. That's the other thing. When you see a house swept away, like there was one swept away in Tullow in County Carlow, which I'm really annoyed about. It's the only thatched house in the town, and Carlow has 5 or 6 thatch altogether. It was just swept away without a buyer leave. The only comment on it was in the document, which was to do with disposal of materials. They said about 30 tons of rubble, and the thatch could be composted. And this is what they had to say about a building that probably reared squads of kids down through the years. That was it. It amounted to 30 tons of rubble, and this stuff that could be compostable. I mean, I don't think they even called it thatch. It was just such an ignorant end for a building. I thought, really, it wasn't terribly impressive. The Heart Fire. Anybody familiar with Henry Glassey's work? Passing the Time in Ballymonone in County Fermanagh, and also he has there's a wonderful video of Henry Glassey. I actually saw it in I think Colleen showed a photograph of a based drinking water in the Shure at Turles. Well, right beside that, right side, is now the Source Theatre and Arts Centre. So they actually had a showing in there of Henry Glassey's, the film about Henry Glassey. It was biographical about him, but I've met Henry Glassey, and he really is a very interesting character, larger than life. His one of his big loves is Turkey, not the fellow now, but the country, and Ireland, and I think there's another country, and he constantly, very interestingly, he presents the storytellers of these countries as artists and as personalities, every bit as important as Rembrandt and Lionel Messi and all the rest of it. He does like these folktale tales, like Peg Sayers on The Great Blasket, that the knowledge that they had and their contribution to the world is every bit as rich, every bit as important. And you can translate that into the vernacular by saying that the most significant vernacular house is every bit as important as the most significant formal house. Castletown. Why do we elevate certain parts of the architectural heritage above others? It's a natural thing to do, but it's wrong. It's profoundly wrong. And here we get to one of my favourite quotes of all, which is Thomas Foster, back in 1847. And the talk I mentioned in Kuwait actually was based on this quote, because I went on to sort of essentially demolish it. The quote, that is, not the place. So he says, and this is in his Letters on the Condition of the People of Ireland, 1847. Take a real Irish Rundale village, and the difference being between Irish and English or Welsh inhabitants of Galway city, cannot be mistaken. Order, which Pope sets down as heaven's first law, you will look for in vain. The cottages look as if pitchforked to one side. Some are placed sideways, some endways, some cornerways. There is never a street. And the crooked passages in and out between the cottages form its only pathways. Their utter forlornness is pitiable. Now, I'm not sure the people that lived in them regarded them as that. There is one of these villages about 4 miles from Galway called Menlo, which I visited and which is a perfect curiosity. It contains about 2,000 inhabitants, and their chief subsistence is derived from supplying Galway with milk. The inhabitants keep great numbers of cattle, which they feed principally on grain bought in Galway. There is no church or chapel in the village, no schoolmaster or doctor, and no magistrate, though the population is as large as many an English town. The way through the village is the most crooked as well as the most narrow and dirty lane that can be conceived. There is no row of houses or anything approaching to a row, but each cottage is stuck independently by itself and always at an acute, obtuse or right angle to the next cottage, as the case may be. The irregularity is curious. There are no two cottages placed in a line or of the same size, dimensions or build. The Irish mind, now this is where he gets to it now. The Irish mind has here, without obstruction or instruction, fully developed itself. As this is the largest village I ever saw, so it is also the poorest, the worst built, the most strangely irregular, and the most completely without head or centre or market or church or school of any village I was ever in. It is an overgrown democracy. No man is better or richer than his neighbour in it. It is in fact an Irish Rundale village. But I think the very telling bit in it is the Irish mind has here, without obstruction or instruction. I mean, it's a piece of naked racism. It's straightforwardly. It's like, I'm surprised that he even published it. Yeah, he'd be certainly no platforms today anyway. But I thought that was very interesting. But it's a similar, it's not dissimilar mindset to lots of people, including contemporary people, including contemporary geographers, who see these places as not necessarily disordered, but as formless, not having a rhyme or rhythm to them. And certainly, on the face of it, they don't look like they have much of a rhyme or rhythm to them. Now, you cannot say that about the villages, about the hamlets on the Dingle Peninsula, because look at the map and you can see there's a rhyme. The village of South Kilkenny, very clearly. But where you have the more amorphous agglomerations like Menlo or Coola, it takes a little bit of teasing out to see how they worked. But there's an internal logic. There's always an internal logic. People aren't thick. People built in a certain way for very particular reasons, often rooted in tradition, but more particularly in practicality. So this is, again, working from local knowledge and from the various writings and so on, particularly Seanachas Marshall Leileish. The place has an internal logic. This is like what you get in an Arab village, quarters, the idea of quarters. Very hard to recognise this elsewhere in Ireland. But if you think of Armagh is an example, Irish quarter, English quarter, Scottish quarter, really unusual. You do get Irish towns, and then the supposition is that, like in Kilkenny, the main bit of it is the English town. I mean, this is the sort of, and the Irish are outside. But it's not so much the ethnicities, but it's the idea of there being quarters. Typically in an Arab village, you would have a head person, usually a man, in charge of each quarter. So between them, they ran the affairs of the whole town. So with Menlo, we actually get an insight into that. There was the whole thing about the place having been divided into 26 units, each unit subdivided laterally, a person in charge of each of the units. They gathered the rents from the others in that unit and passed it on to Blake at Menlo Castle. So that, if you like, sort of system of local government, okay, ultimately controlled by the king, who was the landlord, is very, very interesting and very hard to get at in other places. So And then within Ballyhus there, you can see that there were subdivisions, Park, Pole, and so on. Cuilleog Mhór is hard to figure out what the place name means, but there are 7 long fields there, long narrow fields, and Orm in his book on Ireland thought that this could be the relic of an older field system. It's certainly very different to the generality of the place. These are the Sean Unduri Bhionlach. These are the old founders of the place, and this is in I forget which source this is from, but these are the representatives of the families that were most dominant in the place, and their names were there in the earliest records, and they're still there today. So these are the old founders. One of the questions that Tomás Lailage was asked by de Valdra was, how did it come to be? Why did people settle here? And he came out with an answer where everybody comes out as well. Don't know really, they just came here, they stayed here and thought it was a grand place and just got on with it, So that's what they did. That immediately reminds me of what's the name? Kilreelig in County Kerry. Now this was a place which was turned into an artist colony by Noel Campbell Sharp and others. And what in fact they were describing as a famine village wasn't, because there was an earlier village further up the hill, but they moved from further up the hill to lower down the hill because the effect of local winds was playing havoc with the chimneys. So they upsticked and moved down. Another example there, the Maharees near Castle Gregory, where they were fed up with the sand continued blowing into the houses. So the upsticks abandoned the houses. It is now essentially an archaeological site, humps and hollows, and they moved over to the main road, used the materials from the buildings, the timbers, the stone and so on, and set up again. So you have that degree of autonomy. So it's not, people aren't purely a victim of circumstances. They can make decisions for themselves. This is Tomás's book, which is a really interesting read. And now this is the very last slide. Again, getting under the skin of the settlement. If you just look at the ordnance map, you learn almost nothing. Okay, you get the displacement of buildings, roads and so on to a degree. But then you ask people, and one of the joys of the research that I did and continuing stuff that I do is talking to people. I love chatting to people. It's just something I do. And it's something I urge and encourage everybody who's interested in heritage matters, the landscape, to do. I did recorded interviews with a number of people, young and old, male and female, old local, blow-in, or not blow-in, married in. And often the married ins will say, well, it's no point talking to me now, I didn't come from here. And I say, no, I want to talk to you because you've come from somewhere else. You can look objectively at this place that your husband has grown up in, and you get a very different perspective. I found that particularly in work I did in Kilkenny, South Kilkenny. So you map all the names of places, the Bohreens, the Bohers and so on, and you get, it's really a landscape which is largely based on, I suppose, people's names. To some degree, more prosaic, like Boher and Lachta, where there's a Lacht on that road, which is like something from that you get on Inishmore, the Aran Islands. And then you get further under the skin and you look at, if you like, the sort of folk geography of the place. So you have, Ferry's Crossing Place, the very top bit. A couple of people said, well, horses won't go past that point because there's the ferry, it's a Ferry's Crossing Place. Otherwise you have a spot, Lough Nagorty, where local men used to play cards at that precise spot. Other card houses, actual card houses in the area. Then you had the green areas, the green outlined areas, Cnockan the Muddy, Cnockan the Green, and so on. There were several of these. These were very slight eminences, just the slightest rising ground on a road, which was important to the people of the locality. And I was speaking about this at another conference somewhere, and an Australian anthropologist said, this is very interesting, because he had come upon that in Aboriginal culture in Australia. It's the idea of boulders or slight rise in ground being signifiers, being a geography. So you go from the ordnance map to a geography of the mind, you might say, that only the locals really are inculcated in. Nobody coming in from outside would register any of that. So this is by way of, shall we say, rebutting Foster's, fair enough allegation of perceived formlessness. But once you scratch the surface and you talk to people, you look at what's there, you read up, and you see suddenly there are layers of meaning, and the place becomes totally rational, as distinct from irrational. So, Shinna will, I'll finish it there. Thanks.